Thank you, gentlemen and gentlemen. We are back in session. I'm now pleased to introduce the witnesses and hear their testimony today. I understand, Mr. Montgomery, you have a 4 o'clock flight? 5 o'clock? I'm going to go ahead and take him out of order and just if that's all right with the other witnesses, why don't we do that and have Mr. Montgomery go first, and if he can stay for a while, maybe we get to have questions, but if you have to leave, you have to leave. All right, we have to tell you the rules. The first rule, don't leave the University of Memphis for Kentucky. That's already been violated. Bad day, bad day. Your written statements will be placed in the record. We ask you to limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. You will note that we have a lighting system. It's green means you have 5 minutes. Yellow means 1 minute. Red, over. After each witness presented his or her testimony, the subcommittee members have an opportunity to ask you questions subject to a 5-minute rule. Those are the rules. Page 13, how appropriate. And that relates to Calipari, not to you, sir. First witness is Mr. Phil Montgomery, who was elected to the Wisconsin State Assembly in 1998 and has chaired a variety of committees, including the Assembly Insurance Committee, Financial Institutions Committee, and the Telecommunications Task Force. Most recently, he served as chairman of the Assembly Energy and Utilities Committee for 4 years, played a vital role in several key energy and Montgomery telecommunications reforms, including the Cable and Video Competition Act. During the upcoming 2009-10 legislative session, Representative Montgomery will represent Northeast Wisconsin on the legislature's powerful Joint Committee on Finance, where he will take a leading role in crafting the state's budget. Thank you, Representative Montgomery. As a former state legislator, I appreciate your service and welcome you here. Would you proceed with your testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I greatly appreciate your indulgence. Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Franks, and members of the Subcommittee on Commercial and Administrative Law, I appreciate the invitation to testify before you today on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislators. I am Phil Montgomery, a member of the Wisconsin Assembly, and I serve as the chairman of NCSL's Standing Committee on Communications, Financial Services, and Interstate Commerce. Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to acknowledge your long history as an active member of NCSL. Speaking on behalf of your colleagues in the state legislatures, we are proud of your past service as a state senator and now your leadership in Congress. We hope that during your tenure as a member of Congress and your chairmanship of this subcommittee, you will have numerous opportunities to work together to foster a strong federal-state partnership on interests of mutual concern. Mr. Chairman, you may recall that while you were a member of the Tennessee Senate, you voted to implement Public Law 106-252, the Federal Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act. The legislation established national framework that, when implemented by the states between 2001 and 2002, provided a mechanism on how mobile telecommunications calls involving multiple jurisdictions should be assigned for purposes of tax. The MTSA created the concept that the customer has a place of primary use, which is a jurisdiction with the right to tax wireless calls, even if the call neither originates nor terminates in that jurisdiction. The MTSA was a win-win for both the industry and government. State and local governments supported the MTSA to prevent nowhere taxation and to bring administrative simplicity and cost savings to the tax administration. Furthermore, government organizations supporting the legislation to avoid potential congressional preemption of state taxing authority based on burdens of interstate commerce. The wireless industry supported the legislation to prevent multiple taxation to achieve administrative simplicity and cost savings in the billing process, to avoid expensive audit and litigation exposure when multiple states claim jurisdiction to tax the same call, and to avoid class action lawsuits from customers who claim that companies are improperly collecting taxes even when they are merely complying with state laws. NCSL is once again pleased to support and urge passage of legislation to extend the MTSA provisions to VoIP. This legislation will merely clarify how VoIP calls involving multiple jurisdictions should be sourced for state and local tax purposes. It will not change the tax status of any VoIP provider. As is the case with wireless calls, it is just as important for VoIP communications that there be a clear national rules for determining what jurisdiction is permitted to tax a call, and thus avoid situations where multiple jurisdictions may try to tax the same call, or that a call might escape taxation altogether. While the thought of a tax-free communications may be appealing, we must acknowledge that if a government taxes communication services, as policymakers, we have the obligation to ensure that all providers, regardless of the medium used, should be treated similarly for tax purposes. Taxes on a communication services must be applied in a competitively neutral manner without being used to benefit one provider over another in the marketplace. In conclusion, last year, the National Conference of State Legislators membership unanimously approved a request to Congress for legislation that would extend the MTSA sourcing provisions to Voice over Internet Protocol. The legislation to extend MTSA provisions to VoIP should be considered non-controversial and should move without any opposition. For this reason, we should request that the VoIP sourcing legislation not become a vehicle for non-germane or slightly related amendments that would only slow and probably keep the legislation from enactment. Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to express the concerns of NCSL with regards to the assessment of taxation on VoIP services and our support for legislation on national sourcing rules.
Thank you for your testimony. Representative Montgomery, you must not realize this is the United States Congress. We don't have non-germane and irrelevant and extraneous type of amendments. Something you must be used to in Wisconsin.
In addition to my understanding of legislative time, we have some of the same things back home as well.
Thank you, sir. Our second witness is John Barnes. Mr. Barnes is Director of Global Advanced Voice Product Development. He's primarily responsible for the development, maintenance, and enhancement of Verizon's VoIP suite of services and contact center suite of services targeted at business customers. In this capacity, he's responsible for managing the software development, network deployment initiatives associated VoIP and contract center services. Additionally, he's responsible for the development, maintenance, implementation, and post-implementation support procedures and corresponding systems. Before joining Verizon in 2005, Mr. Barnes served as Director of Voice over IP Service, Product Development for MCI, where he was primarily responsible for the development and enhancement of MCI's VoIP services targeted at business customers. He held management positions focusing on the development of MCI's VoIP services from 2001 onward. Thank you for coming, Mr. Barnes. We'll proceed with your testimony. You need to press your voice button, I think.
Thank you.
VoIP. Voice over program.
Thank you. Chairman Cohen, Representative Franks, and the members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on an issue that will benefit both individual consumers and businesses, drive technological innovation, and boost the U.S. economy. My name is John Barnes. I am the Director of Product Development for Global Global Advanced Voice Services, including Voice over IP services at Verizon. My testimony should provide a better understanding of Voice over IP services, how they work, why the technology is inherently mobile, and why the taxation of Voice over IP services requires modernization. VoIP stands for Voice over Internet Protocol. VoIP is the conversion of traditional analog and digital voice into data packets that are transmitted over an IP-enabled data network. Historically, voice transmissions originated from analog and digital telephones required a dedicated connection to the public switch telephone network, or PSTN. This connection was fixed to a certain location and dedicated to the customer all the way to the PSTN. With VoIP, these voice transmissions are converted to IP signaling and media data packets using either an IP phone or other conversion device. They are routed over an IP-enabled data network, including the public internet. Unlike traditional telephony, when one customer is not using the capacity, it can be used by other customers, resulting in greater network efficiency. Many equipment providers produce a wide variety of IP phones and devices. Telecommunications carriers have developed services using these devices. Carriers' network architecture provide intelligent call routing instructions on how and where to route these calls. And they also provide basic features such as caller ID and call waiting. Enhanced features include features like simultaneous ring or routing incoming calls to multiple devices simultaneously, and selective call screening, to name a few. Voice over IP technology is highly customizable, and many of the features are controlled by the customer without any direct intervention from the service provider. Most voice over IP devices have a traditional 10-digit telephone number. However, they also have an IP address. This is similar to the electronic serial number assigned to wireless devices. IP addresses are a global phenomena. They have no correlation to a physical address or geography. As a result, a VoIP device can be moved to any location where it can be connected to an IP-enabled data network, including the public internet, and continue to send and receive calls. The network recognizes and validates the IP address, but it cannot determine the physical location of the device. Software and equipment manufacturers continue to enhance voice over IP devices. For example, software can be installed on a laptop computer and send and receive VoIP calls. As a result, customers can place calls virtually anywhere they can carry their laptop and connect it to a wired or Wi-Fi internet connection. I brought an example of one such software device that can be used in conjunction with a voice over IP or with a laptop computer. Like wireless services, voice over IP services are typically packaged as a collection of basic and enhanced features and local and long distance calling for one monthly price. These bundled pricing packages benefit consumers and businesses with predictable monthly pricing and the opportunity to reduce their monthly costs. However, they complicate the ability to correlate specific charges to the physical location of a voice over IP device and may have been mobile sometime during the billing period. For businesses, voice over IP services provide several benefits. First, they achieve cost savings through converging both voice and data services over a common network. They can realize operating efficiencies by offering businesses with multiple locations the ability to share physical access capacity across multiple locations, substantially reducing the overall capacity requirement and corresponding costs. This is just simply not technically feasible with traditional PSTN services. In conclusion, the technology has simply outpaced the rules that apply to taxation for telephone services. Consumers are demanding, and the technology will continue to provide new voice over IP services that are inherently mobile. A new system is needed to determine state and local taxation for VoIP services, and the good news is such a system already exists for wireless devices. Congress enacted the Federal Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act in 2000. The industry and government are in a general agreement that Congress needs to expand the federal sourcing rules to include voice over IP services. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Rob Cole, Tax Research Manager for Sprint Nextel, a position he's held since 2003. Worked with industry coalitions and elected officials on a variety of tax policy issues. Mr. Cole was heavily involved with the coalition that worked to seek passage of the Internet Tax Non-Discrimination Act in 03-04 and the extension of that act in 07. Mr. Cole has also worked with several other coalitions involved with telecommunications taxation legislation on state and local levels. Works as a tax analyst for Sprint from 01 to 03 before becoming tax research manager. Prior to coming to Sprint, he worked as an attorney in law clerk with BillSoft, Inc., a telecommunications taxation software company in Kansas. Thank you, Mr. Cole. You're no longer in Kansas. Will you begin your testimony?
Chairman Cohen, Representative Franks, and members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on an issue of significance to millions of customers, businesses, state and local governments across the United States. The emergence of new technologies in the telecommunications industry has accelerated over the past 2 decades. Our industry is in the opening phases of another technological shift in how we provide telecommunication service to our customers. This shift involves the transition from fixed location circuit switched landline services to voice over IP or VoIP, a nomadic broadband service. With opportunities and advancement, however, we're confronted with fitting this new and dynamic service into existing tax laws. The laws were written for services that had a fixed location and phone numbers that identified a specific geographic location. However, there's a precedent for resolving this issue. The wireless providers had similar issues with fitting mobile services into existing tax laws prior to the enactment of the Federal Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act in the year 2000. The Mobile Sourcing Act is one of the great success stories in both clarity and cooperation between our industry and state and local government. It provides clear and simple guidance for the sourcing of wireless telecommunications services for the purpose of collecting and remitting sales, telecommunications, 911, and other taxes and fees. The Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act mandates that wireless carriers collect taxes and source these taxes to the services to the customer's place of primary use. The industry is here to advocate the same sourcing rules for VoIP services. Traditionally, the answer as to which state and local jurisdiction has the authority to tax interstate fixed landline services is well settled. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1989 decided Goldberg versus Sweet, and in that decision held that the location of a call would determine the taxability of that call. And that rule is basically the 2 out of 3 rule. If 2 out of 3 of the following points of a call, origination, termination, and the service address, are in a single jurisdiction, then that jurisdiction has a sole legal authority to tax. However, you can see where this would be a problem with VoIP services. Goldberg is simply inapplicable for VoIP. First, it's not possible for VoIP providers to comply with Goldberg because VoIP providers may not have geographic information as to the location of the point, the call origination or termination. Additionally, VoIP customers have the option to choose an out-of-area telephone number. This could be done, for example, if you live in Washington, D.C., but your family's in Tennessee. You could get a Tennessee telephone number, and your family, they could call you without incurring long-distance charges. Additionally, as we've heard from Mr. Barnes, many VoIP services are nomadic or mobile in nature. They can be moved around, and they can be originated anywhere there's a broadband or high-speed internet connection. Additionally, VoIP service is commonly sold as a flat monthly charge for the service rather than as a call-by-call basis. And finally, there's no call detail record generated. Again, we have no identifying information other than an IP address for many VoIP calls. This is very similar to the issues that wireless faced before the enactment of the Mobile Sourcing Act. Under the Mobile Sourcing Act, the jurisdiction designated by the customer's place of primary use would have the sole authority to levy taxes and fees. And we would advocate this be extended to VoIP services. Thus, if a VoIP user has a Washington, D.C. place of primary use, only D.C. has the authority to tax that call. If a tax jurisdiction determines that place of primary use as applied by the customer is not correct, the Act outlines a procedure for notifying the VoIP provider and for the VoIP provider to make those changes on an ongoing basis. The existing Mobile Sourcing Act has been successful at providing clarity to the wireless service providers, to customers, and to taxing jurisdictions. Expanding that act to include VoIP is sure to be just as successful. By allowing the jurisdiction identified by the customer as his or her place of primary use to tax VoIP services, multiple or nowhere taxation scenarios would be avoided. This protects state and local governments and reduces disputes regarding tax situs. Furthermore, the Act protects consumers by ensuring that taxes based on lines of service, such as flat rate 911 fees, are only imposed on the number of lines that provide simultaneous outward access to the public switch telephone network. Our industry is facing an important deadline in this issue as billing systems need to be created or modified in order to correctly bill and tax on VoIP services. VoIP technology will become exponentially more prevalent in the coming years. In order to have clarity for state and local governments and VoIP service providers, and fairness and simplicity for consumers and businesses, VoIP services should be sourced according to the user's place of primary use. The simplest and most efficient way to accomplish this is to expand the scope of the existing Mobile Sourcing Act to include VoIP service. Again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for the opportunity to testify. and I'm happy to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Final witness is Mr. Jim Eads, Executive Director of the Federation of Tax Administrators, starting in September 2008, capping a career of over 30 years in state tax work. He leads the Federation of Tax Administrators staff in D.C. and around the country as they seek both to serve and represent the tax agencies of the 50 United States, the District of Columbia, and New York City. Prior to accepting this position, he was Director of Public Affairs for Ryan, a major tax consulting company where he represented Ryan and its clients regarding state tax policy and legislation across the country. He's also served as a partner in the National Tax Department of Ernst & Young, a senior attorney and government relations counsel with AT&T, senior tax attorney with Sears Roebuck, chief counsel of the Revenue Division of the Arkansas Department of Finance and Administration, past president of the National Tax Association, and former chairman of the Electronic Commerce Task Force of the Council on Taxation. Thank you, Mr. Eads. Will you please proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today and to speak to you about this issue. I find myself in a unique position that I am able to associate myself with some of the remarks of all of the preceding witnesses. I think all of the preceding witnesses said that the Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act was the product of a lot of negotiation and discussion between government and industry some 9 years ago, and has resulted in beneficial effects, we think, both for industry and government as it has been implemented over the course of the years. I'm not here to obstruct in any way the discussion of these issues. The Federation of Tax Administrators does believe, however, that because of the way that the Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act came into being, and because it has worked so well, that applying its principles to voice over internet protocol, while it may indeed be meritorious, needs to be done without making any substantive changes to the existing Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act. Again, because of the way it was negotiated, because of the cooperation that existed then, and I think continues to exist between the industry and government, what we would urge is that there be some continuing dialogue, working with your staff, Mr. Chairman, to try to make sure that nothing is changed in the Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act that isn't absolutely necessary to be changed to apply its principles to voice over internet protocol. I've submitted written testimony, and I'd be glad to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that and appreciate your testimony. At this time, we have questions, and I would like to ask first, Mr. Barnes, is that the kind of device that Osama bin Laden has? You need to press your button again. You're not good on this VoIP.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I can't tell you what type of device.
But he could use that. That's the kind of thing you could kind of go and, you said nomadic type thing. I mean, he could take that and you couldn't find him, could you?
It is true that nomadic devices do provide extensive mobility advantages, but all of those services have to be connected to a voice over IP service provider's service that comes along with order entry information and customer authentication credentials that help define who the customer is and what use they'll put the services to.
So when you get that type of equipment, you can hide from everybody but the tax man. Is that right?
Or the service provider.
The service provider, okay. Mr. Cole, you indicated in your written statement that VoIP, the industry is facing an important deadline on this issue as billing statements have to be modified in developments. When is that deadline, and what is the deadline?
Well, sir, it's coming very close. Because this is the future of landline telephone service, in my opinion, and I think that Mr. Barnes would concur with that, we're moving, I think we as an industry are moving many of our large enterprise customers towards this type of service. And as you have, necessary allocation of dollars for system development, it's important that we make a decision on this now. And when I say now, I think immediately, in order to make sure that, one, there's no revenue loss to state and local governments, two, that we stay out of the courts, states fighting over who has the right to tax, and three, in fairness to our customers. I deal with questions from customers, and very rarely do I questions about tax situs, because, and when I do, it's very easy for me to just appoint the Mobile Sourcing Act, and the customers are satisfied. It's a great piece of legislation. It's clear, it's concise, it says exactly, how the provider is to bill and remit taxes and determine the situs for those taxes. So in order to have that same level of clarity and certainty for what is really an exponentially growing industry, the answer would have to be sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Representative Montgomery, you've suggested that the Mobile Telecommunications Sourcing Act be a model for legislation to provide clarity that state and local governments need to assess and collect taxes on this type of voice over protocol. Before basing any legislation on a past act, we need to know whether and how well that act is held up in court challenges. Do you know if there have been court challenges to the MTSA, and if so, what was the basis of the action?
I'm going to defer to my lawyer, but as far as I know, there has not been. Again, in fact, it has brought better clarity and order to what could be a very confusing situation. And so using, again, that model of clarity to both the provider, the consumer, and to governments, I think is the major benefit from it. And so if there have not been challenges, I would, again, for the sake that it has brought that clarity, would use it as a model.
I got you. What's the senator's name there from the Capitol that's been there forever? Fred, is it Reichert?
Risher.
Fred, he's still there?
He is. He kind of got crossways of his leader and got removed as the longest serving member in history on the Building Commission. But they reinstated him after there was a bit of an uproar. But he is a great colleague, and he and I share ties.
Well, he's a gentleman. Thank you. Remember me too, if you would. Mr. Eads, in your written testimony, you expressed concerns about 3 proposed modifications to the MTSA, which you say go beyond the scope of merely applying sourcing principles to VoIP. Would you elaborate on those 3 particular proposed modifications, and who's proposing them, and what are your concerns?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to. I've used those in my written testimony as examples. Obviously, we haven't seen any final version of a bill. We've simply seen versions of the bill as it has evolved and may be introduced. Changing the language of the MTSA relating to the hold harmless provisions for the industry seems to us to be of some concern, inasmuch as we're not sure why that change would have any applicability to making those MTSA principles applicable to voice over internet protocol services. The provision relating to multiple VoIP lines may in fact be benign. It's just simply an issue that we believe needs some further discussion. And finally, with regard to the Universal Service Fund, there is some disparity of treatment of that issue by the states, although I think the vast majority of the states do it in a way that this bill contemplates. All we're suggesting is that these are not fall on your sword, undermining the foundation of the Republic issues. We believe that they are simply changes to MTSA that don't appear to be directly related to VoIP, and therefore we would like to have some further explanation of them, working with your staff and with the proponents.
The staff's been so instructed, and we'll do that. Thank you, sir. Mr. Scott, gentleman from Virginia who has a new basketball coach, one of his choosing, I think. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just get all the witnesses just to give us an idea of what's going on now, what the present law is on where you are taxed. If you buy a phone in Maryland, you use your phone in Washington, D.C., you live in Virginia, and your best friend lives in New York, so you got a 212 area code. Now, on cell phones, where do you get taxed today with a cell phone? Where would you get taxed today with VoIP? And if a bill passes, would anything, what would change?
Okay, you may have to run by those locations.
Okay, you buy your phone in Maryland. You use your phone in D.C., you live in Virginia, your best friend lives in New York City. So that's where you're calling back and forth.
What we would do as a provider under the Federal Mobile Sourcing Act with mobile telecommunication services, not VoIP services, would be to rely on the place of primary use that you provide me. What the language of the Mobile Sourcing Act says is that we can default to your home address. So if I kept track of this correctly, that would be in Virginia. You live in Virginia, correct?
Right.
Okay. So under the Mobile Sourcing Act, and if that was the place of primary use that you provided.
Well, if I'm using the phone and if all the outgoing calls are coming out of D.C., since that's where I work and that's where I am during the day.
Again, that would have to be, if you provided us with a D.C. business address.
No, I gave you my I gave you my home address as my address, but I use the phone in D.C.
If you provided your home address, then it would be Virginia. Under the Mobile Sourcing Act, your home street address is that jurisdiction that encompasses that has the sole authority to tax those calls. Now, moving along in your question, under the VoIP sourcing, or for VoIP right now, I think you've illustrated the nature of the question. Which state does get to tax that? We don't know. Right now, we simply do not know. If the Mobile Sourcing Act were to be expanded to include VoIP, then we would rely on that same place of primary use that you provide your home address, and that would be Virginia.
Now, I provided the home address. Is there a little box you can check off or a little blank you can fill in where the primary use is?
Actually, I can't speak for our other providers, but that's something that we require our customer service reps when we set up an account. We ask them specifically, what is your place of primary use? Because that's required by federal law.
Okay, and if I find out that North Carolina doesn't have a tax, can I say Raleigh?
You can find that out, but it would be a violation of federal law. Now, here's the corrective measure in the Mobile Sourcing Act is that if Virginia comes in on audit and determines that's incorrect, that you, the customer, have been giving us false information, here's the beauty of the Mobile Sourcing Act. We're not held harmless going backwards because it's not our fault, we as the provider. And the state is able to say, going forward, hey, this is incorrect. This place of primary use is really in Virginia. You need to collect these, bill and remit these taxes in accordance with a Virginia place of primary use. And that's why I think the Mobile Sourcing Act has been such a great success. It's a win-win situation for all three of the parties. And frankly, I'm not aware of any issues in my time at Sprint where a customer has attempted to game the system in that fashion.
Well, you've said primary use. If I only use the phone in D.C. and all of the calls that you have a list of start off in D.C. and none of them are in Virginia because by the time I get back home it's too late, I'm just using the phone in Virginia, you still tax at my home address.
Right, and there's two reasons for that. One, it's the place of primary use that you provided to us, and two, the default under the Mobile Sourcing Act, and this is also consistent with Streamline, is your home address. The Streamline Sales Tax Act.
But with cell phones, you have a record of where the calls are coming from. Do you have a check?
No, because we're not required to under federal law. Under the Mobile Sourcing Act, we're not required to do that, and the reason why is to prevent D.C. and Virginia from fighting over those tax revenues. This provides Virginia with a clear mandate that they have the authority and they alone to tax those calls.
And if I were to move to Maryland, move my home address to Maryland, then the taxing would change.
Correct. You would have to provide.
So the only thing that seems to matter is the home address.
That's correct. That should be the place of primary use provided by the customer.
Whether it's the primary use or not.
Correct.
Can you argue that your primary use is in a lower tax jurisdiction?
You could argue that, but then again, if
well, I mean, if D.C. has a lower tax in Virginia and I'm actually using it in D.C., can I argue that the primary use is D.C.?
Well, not if you didn't present that as your place of primary use.
When I bought the phone.
Right.
And if the primary use location changes, is there what happens then?
Then it's the customer's responsibility to provide that information to the telecom provider.
Okay.
And again, this has been the settled law for almost 8.5 years now. And I think it's worked very well for both the state and local governments and for industry and frankly for consumers. I've gotten a handful of questions about this sort of thing from customers, and it's very easy to say, hey, you know, this is why you're getting these taxes. It's because you provided this place of primary use. And then, you know, they understand that no one's trying to play games. No states are trying to fight over these taxes. The industry's doing it as required by law.
What is the complication of expanding it to include the VoIP?
I don't see a complication. I think that's the answer to the problem where going back to your scenario, with a VoIP device, a nomadic VoIP device like this here, you have those very same questions, you know, purchased in Maryland, used in D.C., home address in Virginia. There's no clear answer in federal law or state law as to where to tax that call. And so that's why
the computer could be in D.C.
And this is one of many issues that we're dealing with at the state. In Wisconsin, we just enacted the streamlined sales tax, where if you purchase something in Wisconsin or you purchase it on the internet, we are able to collect the tax in another state. And part of that is getting the verbiage of whatever it is you're purchasing down to something discernible. So if you buy a bottle of water or a bottle of juice, it's in essence taxed the same way. So this is just another area that we're dealing with, a new generation of telecommunications that we're trying to make it, again, incumbent on the customer to say, I live in Virginia, but almost all my calls are in Maryland. And so you would then declare Maryland as your primary point. But if you declare your home as Virginia, they can come back later, and if they see 99.9% of your calls are actually in Maryland, then Maryland would have a case to say, well, no, your primary point of use would be Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. King, you're recognized, and if you have questions of Mr. Montgomery, I'd ask you to try to ask them first so he can take off for the airport. He's got a plane to catch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to accommodate that. Mr. Montgomery, it just raises a little curiosity in me, having just passed the streamlined state sales tax that you mentioned. How many states have conformed with the language that Wisconsin has approved?
I believe 28 now have. And again, one of the misconceptions of streamlined sales tax is that it has to be a revenue enhancer. In fact, you can implement it as part of your overall tax policy without having to raise taxes by implementing it.
Revenue enhancer. How would you then, Representative Montgomery, how would you deal with it in Wisconsin, having just been through this debate and having a real feel for trying to broaden and level these sales taxes out so that there are fewer exemptions and that you can conform the exemptions? How would you then react as a state legislature if we were to do the prudent thing here in this Congress and eliminate the IRS, the Federal Income Tax Code, and impose a national consumption tax to supplement your state sales tax?
Yeah, and again, it's a very fine line for us to, again, when you're advocating for simplicity and then again, having federal preemption. As always, I'll stand by the states and ask that, you allow us to work in conjunction with each other to determine that. But again, as I go down my main street and I talk to my retailers of computers and everything else, they are automatically in a very competitive market put at a 5% disadvantage if the consumer chooses to use the internet. So there's a number of different issues that come into this. But overall, I would say that, again, the states have done a great job of working together through NCSL to address those issues.
And have you worked with the American Legislative Exchange Council as well, or what's their level of dialogue in this discussion?
I apologize, I could not hear the group.
The ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council?
And I have, in fact, because I am a member of that organization as well, and they take a different approach, again, are a little bit more on the wanting each individual states. Again, there is a balance. And again, when I talk to people at ALEC, again, you can implement this without raising people's taxes. I won't use the revenue enhancement, but you can implement this and, again, represent your people on Main Street that are having to compete on the internet against providers. I have a provider of Sony computers in my district. He is a very big supporter of University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He regularly loses out on bids to people that don't even live in our state, let alone pay any kind of property tax or support to the university.
I agree with you, Representative Montgomery, that it's a disadvantage to our Main Street businesses to have a disproportionate sales tax that might be sold over the internet. It's part of the motive for this. It's your hope, then, that the rest of the states will follow and conform to the legislation that you passed in Wisconsin and the 27 other states?
Well, again, I would hope that they each look at it in such a way that I did not implement it in my state. In fact, I voted against it. But because it was used as, again, as a revenue enhancer as opposed to an overall tax policy. But I would say this, that again, the aspect of it that levels the playing field for my Main Street brick and mortar businesses is something that I totally agree with.
I thank you, Mr. Montgomery, and I want to make sure that if you do have to run and catch that plane, I won't come back with a follow-up question to you. And I did have a couple of others that I'd wanted to direct across the panel, and just a short one to Mr. Eads before I go to the telecommunications companies. And that was also in response to one of your responses to the questions, I think, Mr. Eads, or perhaps when I read your testimony. But are you, as an organization, working hand in glove with NCSL?
Representative King, we're in the same building as NCSL. We're in the same building with the National Governors Association. We're in the same building with a lot of associations of state officers. The Federation of Tax Administrators represents tax agencies. So I don't come from a constituency in which I can come up here and sign off in behalf of the states on something. I come as a representative of an organization that has what we hope is some technical knowledge about how tax administration works and how tax policy gets implemented. And so the short answer to your question is yes. We work with NCSL, we work with the National Governors Association, but we are here primarily as a resource about what are the technical and policy issues regarding tax administration, and that's what we try to provide.
Mr. Eads, I understand your professionalism in this, and I'm curious as to what level of involvement then in the same building with NCSL, how involved then is the American Legislative Exchange Council? Are you able to work with them also?
We work, ALEC is not in our building. I have worked with ALEC in my prior lives. I know ALEC members, and the Federation of Tax Administrators is willing to work with anybody who is interested in efficient tax administration and good tax policy, absolutely.
That really does, I think, answer my question. I just wanted to bring that up to that level of, and I see that my light has turned red. However much curiosity that I have, I'm gonna defer to the rules of the committee. And
if you'd like to ask another question, you've been here, and I appreciate it. And you go ahead, Mr. King.
Well, thank you. And I do have, and I listened to each of you. I could go to Mr. Barnes if I could, and I mentioned the situation, and you're concerned about how taxation, multiple taxation that might take place, the possibility of multiple taxation. What's your level of comfort after testifying in this hearing that there won't be multiple taxation on the services that you provide?
Excellent question. I believe that as we define clear and concise taxation methodology from the outset, that we can establish those rules in advance of tax assessment, and as a result, we can avoid in advance any opportunities for double taxation.
Thank you. And Mr. Cole, same question.
I think that frankly, sir, if this legislation is passed, I don't think you'll see any multiple taxation. I think if this legislation is not passed, I think you could conceivably have a customer that receives taxes from several jurisdictions. One provider might choose to look at the law in that state one way, Sprint may look at it another way, and the customer may get different state taxes from different providers. I mean, it's really a situation where that type of confusion could exist if we don't establish a clear framework at the outset.
Okay, and if I'm presuming here a little bit because I didn't hear the early part of the testimony. I regret I was called away, but do I understand this, that we would have and we would deploy the technology that would automatically direct the taxes to the jurisdiction where they should be applied because of predominant use?
That's correct. We already have that on the wireless side, and it would be much easier to implement if we were to go to this on the VoIP side. And I know that it would probably be just as easy for the third-party software providers like Vertex that provide some of our tax rating software to the various carriers.
Let me just submit that in my experience looking at efficiency and mistakes and error, that the most persistent errors are created by human beings, and the most efficiency that we provide are with machines and technology. And so, with that, I'm always going to want to err on the side of let the technology make the decision, because human beings are fallible. And I appreciate the testimony of all of you, and Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this, and I would be happy to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your attendance, and that Mr. Scott, Mr. Johnson here earlier. And thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days to submit any additional written questions, which we'll forward to the witnesses and ask you to answer promptly. They'll be made part of the record. Without objection, the record will remain open for 5 legislative days for the submission of any other additional materials. Again, I thank everyone for their time and patience, particularly Mr. Eads. You've had previous lives, you and Shirley McLean. It's nice to have had you here. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Commercial and Administrative Law is adjourned.